Week 7 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week number 1, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. A lot of people coming into the year thought Jefferson wasn't going to be good with either J.J. McCarthy, who went down with injury, obviously, in training camp, or Sam Darnold. But this season, putting up the numbers, he's been elite once again. And this week in a matchup versus the Detroit Lions, a team he's had great success in his division throughout his NFL career. Once again, number 2, Jamar Chase. Cincinnati Bengals, Jamar Chase last week. It was a down game for him in a plus matchup at the New York Giants. And this week, a tougher matchup with Denzel Ward most likely covering Chase in this one in Cleveland. But we know this Brown team, they really haven't covered well this season. We saw the Philadelphia Eagles go out there. A.J. Brown, 6 for 116 and a touchdown versus Brown defense. And Devonta Smith found the end zone as well. So Chase, he's matchup proof. He's one of the best receivers in the league. And last week, coming off a mid-game for his standards, I believe he bounces back versus division rival number 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. Last week, it was a quiet ball game, surprisingly, for St. Brown, especially 47-9. They won the game, was Detroit. This week, not the greatest matchups indoors in Minnesota, but I believe this Lion team's going to overcome a great defense of the Minnesota Vikings. I believe they're still going to put points on the board. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's matchup proof. Even in his down games, he's still scoring 15 fantasy points. And once again this week in the big game, I believe he shows up and puts in a great performance. Number 4, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles returned last week. Had the monster game, was A.J. Brown. Hamstring looked 100%. And this week in a matchup with the New York Giants, where they've had a lot of trouble with this Philadelphia Eagle offense over the last couple seasons, A.J. Brown, he's looked healthy, and we know he's a big-time, big play wide receiver. Number 5, staying in the same game, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. And Neighbors, unfortunately, he's been out the last 2 weeks with a concussion, and it's a bad concussion, obviously, so hopefully he returns. In this one is Malik Neighbors. We know he's one of the more exciting and great rookie wide receivers we've seen over the last couple seasons, and we know this Philadelphia Eagles secondary obviously beefed up in the offseason, but it hasn't translated to on the field. So if he's back in this one, I think Neighbors goes out there and has a nice performance with fresh legs. Number 6, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Chris Godwin, a monster game, once again, one of the best receivers in all pro football. And ever since he's been moved back to the slot this year, his numbers have gone back up to where they were 3-4 seasons ago, where Tom Brady was the quarterback for this Tampa Bay Buc team. So the best 1-2 combo at the wideout position, I believe, with him and Mike Evans. And Chris Godwin, like I said, he can run all the routes. He can run in the slot. He can make plays. And this week versus the Baltimore Ravens in a potential shootout on Monday Night Football, I think Godwin has another nice game. 7, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. Cooper Kupp, I believe, is going to play in this game. Still one of the best players in all pro football, I believe, especially at the wide receiver position. And this week, a great matchup versus the Vegas Raiders, where they just can't stop anyone defensively. This is an indoor game in Los Angeles, which is always a plus. And I know this Ram team, they're 1-4 on the season, but Cooper Kupp, he's just going to be a wide receiver that's going to get peppered with targets, especially if he's 100% now and Puka Nacua is still out. And we know no one on that secondary for Vegas could stop him. Number 8, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. 2 weeks in a row now, London's put up nice performances, especially 2 weeks ago on Thursday night versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. 13 catches, 154, and a touchdown. And then last week, another good game at the Carolina Panthers. So this week, a good matchup versus the Seahawks. You would think the Seahawks secondary would be one of the best secondaries in the league, but obviously that hasn't been the case the last couple weeks. They've been getting torched is the Seattle Seahawks team. Last week we saw it once again where they gave up a bunch of points, where Deebo Samuel had a big game, George Kittle had a big game, and I think Drake London once again is locked in to have a nice performance. Number 9, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. Reed's been one of the best receivers all season long in fantasy football, especially with Jordan Love back on the center over the last few weeks. So this week in a potential shootout in Lambeau Field with the Houston Texans coming to town, I think Jaden Reed's going to put up his numbers. He's one of the best yard after catch wide receivers in the league. I know he's banged up, left last week's game for a little bit and returned. And this week versus Houston, I like his upside once again. Number 10, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Evans, one of the best receivers we've seen in the last decade. 10 years in a row, over 1,000 yards. And I believe he's going to do it once again here is Mike Evans. Him and Baker Mayfield have been on the same page. They've been making big plays. I know there's some off games he don't have the numbers, and Chris Godwin has the numbers. And then there's games where both these players put up numbers. So this week in a potential shootout on Monday night, I think Mike Evans will get his numbers once again. Number 11, Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. So obviously Nico Collins out minimum 3 more weeks with a hamstring injury. Stephon Diggs scored a touchdown last week. Him and Stroud have a good rapport. He's one of the team captains. I know this week a tougher matchup at Green Bay. They've been one of the better defenses in all pro football, but I think Diggs overcomes it if Jair Alexander's on him in this game. Has another good performance. Number 12, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. 2 weeks in a row, 2 games over 100 yards for Zay Flowers. Last week, 9 for 132 versus the Commanders. And this week at Tampa Bay, a secondary that hasn't been all that great this season, even though I know they've gotten some pieces back. Antonio Winfield, the highlighted player, coming back into the secondary last week. But they still gave up 27 points to a Saint offense that was all banged up with Olave out early in that game and Derek Carr, who's out going into it. So I think Zay Flowers on Monday night in a high-scoring ball game goes out there once again, and it wouldn't be surprising to me if he has over 100 yards for the 3rd week in a row. 13, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith, he returned. He found the end zone in his first game back after coming off a concussion. And this week, a good matchup at the New York Giants, who've had a lot of trouble with Devonta Smith in division play over the last few seasons. So Devonta Smith, we know he can run the routes. We know he's a big-time boom player when he really hits. And if he gets a crossing route and there's room to run, you know he's going to take it to the house like he did last week. So this week, once again, we could see a similar performance. 14, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Scary Terry and Jaden Daniels have been on the same page since that big Week 3 victory at the Cincinnati Bengals on Monday night. So this week, a cupcake matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. They can't stop anyone. We saw London go off for a big game last week once again. And this week, I think Scary Terry goes out there and he finds the end zone once again for his 4th touchdown of the season. 15, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks at 2 weeks in a row under double-digit fantasy points. But the targets are there for DK Metcalf. This week, indoor game on a fast track. We saw Deontay Johnson have a nice performance versus Falcons secondary. And I think DK Metcalf, after last week, all the barking and complaining on the sidelines, him and Geno Smith and the offensive coordinator are going to get on the same page and get easier design plays to get Metcalf the football, because he does have 3 games this season over 100 yards receiving. 16, Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. So 3 out of 4 games since Dalton's been inserted to the starting lineup. Deontay Johnson's had value and putting up fantasy points, but also he could be a trade candidate. We've seen already Devontae Adams, Amari Cooper traded away from Adams, going to the Raiders, to the Jets. Cooper from the Browns, Buffalo Bills, and they got 3rd-round picks. So I think they could fetch a 3rd or 4th rounder. Is this Panther team for Deontay Johnson, because they're going nowhere this season. I know they don't have much in terms of wide receiver. They got Xavier Legette, Jonathan Mingo. He's been a bust so far and hasn't done much. So Johnson definitely could get traded in the couple weeks here with the trade deadline approaching. But this week in a good matchup at the Commanders, who we gave up 132 yards to Flowers last week. I think Johnson has a good game. 17, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Garrett Wilson last week, a monster performance, over 100 yards, found the end zone, almost found the 2nd touchdown, but got destroyed by 2 defenders by the Buffalo Bills. But now with Devontae Adams in there, I think he'll see more single coverage is Garrett Wilson, but also targets might be taken away with the ESP and the rapport with now Devontae Adams and Alan Lazard for Aaron Rodgers definitely could take away a little bit from Garrett Wilson. I think in this one, we're not going to see Adams a whole lot, where he'll play 50-60% of the snaps coming off the hamstring injury. If it was even real, who knows if it was just a ploy to get traded away. But anyway, I think Garrett Wilson, he could go out there and even in a tougher matchup at Pittsburgh, be a solid number 2 receiver for owners. 18, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. Last 2 weeks, T. Higgins really turned things up. It's in a contract season for him. And with single coverage, with obviously rolled and double coverage Jamar Chase's way, it's always going to be easy for that second receiver to make plays and get open. So this week in Cleveland, where their defense can't stop anyone the last couple weeks, I like Higgins to have another good game. 19, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. So Hill, he struggled, no doubt about it, with 2 out of the lineup, but he's still going to put up numbers, and it just takes one big deep ball for Tyreek Hill to have his day. So this week in a pretty good matchup at the Indianapolis Colts, where their defense really hasn't stopped anyone this season, and Tyler Huntley maybe more into the playbook after he's only been here a month with the Miami Dolphins, and that bye week could help him. It wouldn't be surprising if Tyreek Hill outdoes this number 19 number and is a top 10 receiver in points this week, but I'm going to temper expectations. 20, Brian Thomas of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Last week it was a down game for Brian Thomas, and that has to do with Evan Ingram returning to the lineup. 10 catches, 102 yards in that one for Evan Ingram. Brian Thomas had a lousy game, 3 catches, 27 yards, but he's a big-time wide receiver, and I think if anyone's going to get phased out, it's going to be more Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk. I know Davis had 5 for 45 and 2 touchdowns last week, but that's the Gabe Davis motto. He'll go out there, have a big game, everyone will run out to the waiver wire, pick him up, and then he'll be non-existent, all the numbers. So I think this week in a beatable matchup back in London versus the Patriots, where their secondary hasn't been good this season, I think Thomas bounces back. 21, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. It was good to see Deebo last week find the end zone, but still low volume, 3 for 102 and a touchdown with that 76-yard touchdown, burning the secondary at the Seahawks. So this week a tougher matchup versus the Chiefs. Obviously they're familiar with Deebo, seeing him in the Super Bowl 2 times over the last 4 seasons. And this Chief defense, they just don't give up big plays, really. So this week it's going to be a little bit of a tough sledding, I think, for this passing game at times for San Francisco. 22, Devontae Adams of the New York Jets. So Adams, he got his wish. He got traded to the New York Jets for a 3rd-round conditional pick, and him and Aaron Rodgers reunited. And we know Adams had his best years with obviously Aaron Rodgers at the quarterback position, helping him win a few MVPs. So this week a tough matchup at Pittsburgh. Like I said early in the video, I don't see Adams playing more than maybe 60% of the snaps, and he's got to get the playbook down, even though him and Rodgers could go out there right now and play backyard football, obviously with their ESP and with their rapport, but also with another good receiver like Garrett Wilson in the lineup. Targets might be going down for Adams as the year goes on, and also he's a 32-year-old wide receiver where injuries are going to be worse as his career goes on, and obviously losing a step as well is a possibility, and I think we've seen that already with Adams over the last season and change. 23, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. Every week he's putting up double-digit fantasy points, besides one time in 5 games as JMO. So last week a big touchdown at the Dallas Cowboys, a 37-yarder. Him and Jared Goff have a good rapport, and he's finally reaching his potential as Jameson Williams, where the first 2 seasons of his career, suspension and injuries did him in, but now he's been healthy, not suspended, and him and Goff are getting things going. But this week in Minnesota, they're a team that doesn't give up a lot of long balls and deep plays. And the only concern I have with Jameson Williams is the volume hasn't been great. He's only got 2 games with 5 catches this season, and the rest of the games less than that. And the targets even haven't been great, 7 at most in 2 games as well. But this week in Minnesota, I think as a number 2 wide receiver, he could be decent. 24, Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. So Harrison, he was a high draft pick in fantasy leagues, 2nd, 3rd round for most leagues. Even some leagues 1st round if people really will reach him. But now with a concussion and with a pretty tough matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers, I think Marvin Harrison, you got to tamper up expectations a little bit. Obviously, he's a rookie. I still believe he's a true number 1. And I think next season, towards the end of the year, is where he's really going to put up the monster numbers. Him and Kyler Murray still got to get on the same page. Murray, I still believe, is not 100% as well, coming off the ACL off a year now for this Arizona Cardinal team. And this offense has just been inconsistent this season. But Marvin, it just takes, I believe, a couple games for him to move back up the rankings. Number 25, Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. Tank Dell, he filled in last week for Nico Collins' role, playing the number 2 wide receiver. He found the end zone. We know he's one of the more speedy wideouts in all pro football, is Tank Dell. And this week, it's definitely a tough matchup with the Green Bay Packers, where they've been a solid and stout defense for the most part this season. But between these 2 teams, it wouldn't be surprising to me if we see a shootout. So I think Dell has another good performance. 26, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. I know the targets have been inconsistent this season for JSN, but this week a good matchup at the Falcons, where the secondary isn't all that great. Last week found the end zone. I know it was a salvage touchdown at the end, but Jackson Smith, he's getting more playing time. He's running more routes. And this week at the Atlanta Falcons, I think he's a solid number 2 back-end option, flex option. 27, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So I'm just not high on Ayuk at all. He missed all the training camp, got his fat contract, and now he's not a player doing much. I know he had the big pop game in week 5 for 8 for 147, but that was the Arizona Cardinals. And then last week in a division matchup versus Seahawks, only 5.70 fantasy points. So this week, a tough matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Like I said, Brandon Ayuk, he really hasn't done much. And George Kittle, best passing option for Brock Purdy this season. is George Kittle. He's making plays, he's finding the end zone, and he's been the most consistent player between him, Debo, and Ayuk. So like I said, Ayuk, he hasn't played great, and I hope a couple weeks ago when I said to sell him high, fantasy owners did, because there's a lot of mouths to feed over here in San Francisco. And like I said, Ayuk got his money, and it looks like he's dogging it a little to me. 28, Amari Cooper of the Buffalo Bills. So a great deal it was for the Buffalo Bills. They needed number one wide receiver over here in Buffalo. And Amari Cooper, I know it's been a down year for him, where he hasn't even caught half his targets. But Deshaun Watson, he's been a bad quarterback, and it's a major upgrade to go from Watson to obviously the best quarterback, or one of the best, depends how you think about it, with Josh Allen. So Allen gets the number one wide out in Amari Cooper. I don't think he's going to play 100% capacity, where he has to pick up the playbook in 4 or 5 days now. But between now and Sunday, in a tougher matchup versus Tennessee, where, believe it or not, this secondary's been pretty good, led by Snead at the cornerback position. But Amari Cooper is a professional, and it reminds me a few years ago where Cooper got traded from the Raiders to the Cowboys at about week 6, week 7. He really had a monster year and turned the season around for Dallas, where I think he could help Buffalo and he could start putting up numbers. But this week, like I said, where he's not in the playbook really, he's got to pick it up, and he's not going to play a lot of snaps. He's a back-end option as a flex. 29, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. Xavier Worthy, the gadget guy, deep ball threat. Not going to be that true number one option in this passing game, even with Rashee Rice and Hollywood Brown out for this Kansas City Chief team. But the upside is definitely there for Worthy. And now the last 2 weeks, since Rice went down with injury, found the end zone in week 4, Chargers. And then week 5 versus the Saints, he found the end zone as well. And last week, the bye week. And I've said this a lot in videos. After the bye week, rookies, they get into the playbook more plays are drawn up for them. And I think that obviously could be the case here with Xavier Worthy. And you can't teach speed. He's a decent option. 30, Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. So Wan'Dale Robinson, I've said this a lot, he fits this Giant offense perfect as a number 2 option, underneath route runner, yard after catch type of player. And we know Daniel Jones don't have the big arm, where he likes going underneath and hitting those guys on mesh routes and slant routes and out routes. And that's what exactly Robinson's been running. So he's been a double-digit PPR player all season long. And this week in a matchup versus Philadelphia, where there could be a lot of garbage time, I think Robinson once again is a viable option. 31, Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs. I know he had the monster game in week 5 versus New Orleans Saints. 7 for 130 is Juju. We know he knows the playbook. We know he had a big year with them a few years ago, then left in free agency for the Patriots. It didn't work out there. And now it was time for him to step up with Rashee Rice out. But this week, a tough matchup at San Francisco. Smith-Schuster, I think we're going to see ups and downs with him. And we even saw that a few years ago, where he was the number 1 for this Chief team. So this week at San Francisco, I don't believe he's going to crack the 100-yard mark. 32, Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons. So Darnell Mooney, we've seen some good games out of him this season. Going back 2 weeks ago, his big game was 9 for 105 and 2 touchdowns versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in that crazy shootout overtime ball game. And last week, we didn't see much from Mooney. But this week, a decent matchup versus the Seahawks, where their defense hasn't been all that great, especially the last few weeks. But a lot of mouths to feed over there in Atlanta. Bijan out of the backfield. Obviously, Drake London, him and Kirk Cousins, their rapport has definitely gone up over the last few weeks. And also, as well, Kyle Pitts has played better. So Darnell Mooney in the passing game, right now the third option. And there's going to be boom or bust weeks for him. 33, Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts. So Josh Downs, he's been great, no doubt about it, with Joe Flacco. But now Anthony Richardson back in the lineup. And he definitely takes a big hit, is Josh Downs, where he's been a hot waiver wire pickup over the last 2 weeks. So this week, a pretty good matchup versus the Dolphins. I know Jalen Ramsey might be on him at times, but I believe Jalen Ramsey is an elite cornerback, just isn't that guy anymore. But like I said, with Anthony Richardson in the lineup, this whole receiving core takes a big hit, in my opinion. 34, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. George Pickens, it's been puzzling over the last couple weeks, where in week 5 versus the Cowboys, they sat him down for a little bit in that ball game, where they were trying to limit his snaps, was the excuse from Tomlin. And then last week in that matchup at the Vegas Raiders, a very beatable one. It was a mid to poor performance, 3 catches, 43 yards for Pickens. So this week in a tough matchup versus the New York Jets, where I believe Sauce Gardner is going to be covering him most of the ball game. I just don't believe there's a high ceiling at all with Pickens. With Russell Wilson in the lineup to start most likely, where him and Pickens don't have a rapport. He just doesn't have a high ceiling this week. 35, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So maybe I'm low on him this week as Addison, but he's going to be boom or bust. I believe, at times as well. We know a couple weeks ago he returned in the lineup versus the Packers in week 4, had a big ball game, finding the end zone twice. And then week 5 in London versus the Jets in a tougher matchup, he only had 6.5 fantasy points. This week in a potential shootout versus division rival, the Detroit Lions. Definitely he could have a high ceiling as Jordan Addison, but I have to see a little bit more out of him before I move him up the ranks, because like I said, Justin Jefferson's getting peppered with targets. Aaron Jones has been solid out of the backfield, and Sam Darnold's a quarterback that's zeroing in on only a couple targets, it seems like. In the 36th and final wideout rankings, Ladd McConkey, the Los Angeles Chargers, I think he's their more talented wideout. I know he plays a lot of slot, and I know the numbers really haven't been there in the passing game with Justin Herbert this season for McConkey, but this week, Monday Night Football, beatable matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals. Their secondary isn't good at all. We saw last week Jordan Love threw for a touchdown party. Romeo Doubs, 2 touchdowns in that one. Jaden Reed found the end zone. And Christian Watson found the end zone as well. And I think Ladd McConkey in this one could have a decent performance versus a pretty bad secondary. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 7 of the fantasy football season.